سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to part 2 of Atheism, the Denial of God. If you recall from part 1, just thought we can recap. We touched upon this topic, and part 1 was obviously about atheism is dead, long live atheism. Tried to use some provocative titles. And we chose Islam as a faith to compare with atheism, and we gave our justification for that. We then went into great detail about what this new atheism is, and if at all it is new. And we reached an interesting conclusion that there's nothing new about it, and then there's everything new about it. And that was a little conundrum that we had to try to then resolve. And we hopefully did that. We explained the arguments from within atheism, the new atheism circles, of the fact that it's seen as progression, it's seen as a way forward. And we explained throughout, using verses from the Quran, about the fact that it's nothing new. This argument has been mentioned many a times before, and it's an argument which is very much based on a belief system and a view regarding the original text, like Asatir al-Awwaleen, fables and myths. And but the nothing and everything, the everything part was with 9/11. And Dawkins himself says that 9/11 changed everything. And we see this more aggressive, belligerent, even military or militant attitude then coming through from so-called scientists who aren't emotionally engaged with their research and use their mind to resolve all things. But clearly some of the quotes that I have for you there, especially the last one, clearly show their contempt and hatred for faith. So this is extremism coming in, and I intentionally chose the word religion when I'm describing new atheism. So to take up Dawkins' point, we described how many people had been killed in the war deaths, and then how many had died in Western Europe anyway, due to particularly because 9/11 being the starting point, particularly with Islam, Muslims carrying out these particular acts, even though I didn't agree with this term Islam inspired, because Islam inspires peace. So is it a faith or is it anti-faith? Well, I disagree that it's an anti-faith. It is a faith. And we saw what they were trying to do, where they were trying to replace God with science, replace religion with the scientific process, and replace the religious experts with scientists. That's what they aimed to do. So then we went and tried to discuss that is science a substitute for Allah? And it didn't make sense how science, a thing, a means, a process, a way of thinking, could substitute for the existence of a deity which is worshipped. So we looked at it to see if science was an antonym or something of belief or with faith, and we explored that. So we looked at the two broad approaches that we can have, empirical and rational, in terms of determining knowledge, and we explained the empirical and then we followed up by explaining the rational, and showed that are there any evidences to show that this proves that science is a substitute for Allah? Well, it doesn't make sense, because these are both means to ascertain knowledge. It's a way to measure knowledge from outside of us, of those things that can be observed, or it's a means to determine and so internalize knowledge from within, reasoning, hypothesizing, and things of that nature. So they are means, not so. We've just got a phone going on in the background. I'm sure somebody will pick it up, just to prove that, this is really happening. Okay, no one's picking it up. This is definitely live. Wow, that's an exceptionally long ringtone. Okay, that's gone. Let's hope they don't ring back. So, in other words, they are means, they are the means, not the sort. So basically, we can't substitute science for Allah. We can't substitute science for Allah, because we're comparing apples and pears. And so we did not raise the question, who is the God for the atheist? And we will touch upon that in today's part. But anyway, let's just finish off. So we explain the scientific process, and I quoted many verses from the Quran. And you notice that I've restricted myself just to the revealed text. I've not mentioned the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, his sayings which are termed as the hadith. I've not mentioned statements made by the scholars of within the Islamic. So there's much more literature and information available. I've restricted myself solely to the Quran, the revealed, to be as close to this, to challenge the argument coming through from the new atheists. And then we have the rational model explained, which clearly we can evidence it, and for some reason all these are on this side and this one decided to disappear over there. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly is not against the scientific process. I've shown that. So then I made some statements that, look, these have all just been fabrications and deceptions, and it's just covering. And this is the word the word kafir comes from, is ones who use these tricks and deceive people in thinking what they're saying is correct, and they conflate issues and understandings. Because when we look at the new atheists, and I did that in the introduction, and I will discuss that in more detail today, their main argument is against Christianity, but they put all the beliefs together, so they extend and extrapolate their arguments from Christianity onto the other faiths, which is wrong. It's definitely not the scientific way, especially when you've only got a handful of religions. It's easy to compare and determine the comparison of them, of whether they agree to support science or they don't support science, than just to do on Christianity. And that is because most of these individuals come from a Christian background, so they've done no research whatsoever. So who's going against the scientific process? That's what needs to be asked. And that's why I came up with the conclusion of hypocrisy. And they do no different than they claim what some of the people of the faith do. And I did emphasize this false dichotomy that's being brought up, and it's leading people into thinking, wait a minute, science or blind belief? Well, obviously science is right. So it's this dichotomy of where you have to make a choice, and this dichotomy is wrong, because science leads to Islam. Science is the observation, science is the reasoning, and that eventually leads a person to say that God exists, Allah exists. That's what it leads them to. Then from there onwards, they're going to need to speak or hear what Allah has to say in order to understand things better. And that reaches us to part 2, which is idol, I God, there is no God. And this, again, from the atheistic point of view, demonstrates who they accept as a God. So what have the new atheists replaced Allah with? Well, there we have it. God for believers, here's the Arabic name, Allah. God for the believers, yes, they are believers, is the new atheists. They themselves are God, because we can't put science there. We tried. It just wouldn't fit. It didn't make sense. So what's the religion? Yes, it is a religion. Islam. Atheism. So who are the experts? New atheists, religious scholars. Now, these are humans. He is not human. These are humans, but here's the problem. They're the very same humans. So we have a serious problem here within the atheistic mindset compared to the religious mindset. They're not asking to be worshipped. They're not asking to consider them to be gods. In fact, in Islam in particular, they have no title whatsoever. Even in terms of being an intermediary, they can't have that title whatsoever. They're just learned individuals who educate us. Well, that's what they're supposed to do. Here we have a group of people who actually then claim to be God as well. And hopefully I've demonstrated that to you. And Eagleton carries out an assessment of Dawkins' arguments, and he describes it as victory on the cheap. So let's see how he has analyzed Dawkins' arguments. He says, first of all, what Dawkins does is he selects a far from the comprehensive subset of theistic arguments. That's the first thing he does. What he then does is he caricatures the selected argument. And I've already mentioned his reduction ad absurdum attitude that he has as well. He refers to, but does not quote, medieval rather than contemporary versions. And this is with Christianity. Again, as I mentioned to you, Dawkins has not understood. All he's done then is extrapolated his arguments from Christianity onto the faith. And we'll see, as from a Muslim perspective, why there can be areas for concern. He then gives the appearance of blowing away these arguments using assertion rather than argument, or a charge of logical invalidity that depends upon the fact that you are attacking a straw man. That's what he's supposed to say, not a straw man. or which misses the point of the argument you are attacking. But does the scientific way explain everything? And we've already mentioned that the empirical and the rational models are limited. It's basically what can be observed and what can be measured. That's all the empirical can do. And the rational is what we can hypothesize and reason. So all these are limited by the human. So if we are the means to determine God, then our limitations will produce a limited God. So when individuals say that God was created because man needed God, so God is a creation of man's mind and man's attitude, that couldn't be further from the truth, because a God by definition has to be superior than the human. And if the human is limited in both his empirical and his rational way, then his God, if he is making it, is going to also be limited. It is for this reason that when new atheists are themselves making their own God, then that God is obviously going to be limited. So can the science, and we further say this, can the scientific way answer what is me? Now, yes, it might answer that I'm an organic species, that I'm human, and it can answer things in those ways, but can it answer what is me? Because me is not just the physical aspect that one sees. Can it answer, is there another world after this? Well, isn't that beyond observation and measurement, the fact that it's another world which comes after? Can we hypothesize and reason? Possibly, even though I will argue, and I have argued, that we can use these to determine many of the things that we believe in. Well, maybe another question would have been, is there angels? Do angels exist? Well, I can't achieve that through this understanding. What does Allah want from me? What does God want from me once we've accepted that there is a God? Because that's not possible through this. What's my purpose? Again, you can't answer that through these questions, because it's not a question that science can measure. It's not a question that science can reason with. Why am I not content except when I believe in Allah? And we've seen that explanation given already when we talked about happiness and contentment. If you recall back to the 3 points which were discussed at the conference, I think in 2006, one was to replace replace God with science, and the other was to introduce the scientific way. The third one was, this is obviously to try to remove God and replace God, not just remove God. You see, an atheist, you could understand, they would make effort to remove God, but an atheist who is actually replacing God is a very different argument altogether. So can we be good without Allah? Well, let's see. Here I argue, no, we can't, because let's look at social Darwinism, for instance. Now, when we know with social Darwinism, Darwinism started out just based on observations. It was an observation carried out by Charles Darwin, and I picked this up in our next couple of two-part series, rather, that we will discuss in this, inshallah, after Ramadan, and which possibly this is when this will be going out. So we will follow this series. And social Darwinism looked at other people as being less humans. So, for instance, when they landed, when the European white man landed in the Americas, then the people there were considered as savages. They were not considered. They were considered less human. That they had not fully developed. That they had not fully evolved, which legislated and permitted them to wipe out people. So we see the Native Americans wiped out. We see many Native Africans wiped out. We see many Native Australians wiped out. We see similar issues taking place in the Indian subcontinent and places elsewhere. Because it's easy to, when you look at people and you see them as a lesser human, where does that come from? Now, if if we accept an Allah, then we know Allah says that everybody is equal. Everybody is held equal, irrespective of their culture, irrespective of their practices, irrespective of their skin color. The only individuals who aren't held equally are those who deny Allah, those who deny God. They're not held equally, because they're denying the very creator that created them. But apart from that, any other identifier, whether gender, whether race, ethnicity, is not an issue, and you would not see that happening if people of religion, and I mean people of religion who follow what Allah says, not just people who claim to be people of religion. And I guess one of the best examples that we have is Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was a very sophisticated secular society. It was not a religious society, and Nazism itself was, as I quoted here, motivated by an ethic that prided itself on being scientific. So the scientific way, the scientific methodology produced the best nation that's ever produced, which was Nazi Germany, and that's what it led to. But then obviously, once Nazi Germany was put down, and everybody went sort of and realized that science, people who were in charge of science were now out of control, then we've taken a step back. But what we've seen now, particularly in the noughties and beyond, is that now individuals, again, from the new atheism mindset, believe science is the answer. Is science an answer? What we've already argued is that science is actually a process. Okay, science is amoral. It has no moral compass. It does not determine the ethics behind what it's doing. It does not give a value to what it's doing. So we had the Nazi Germany eugenics going on, and I read in preparation for this, I read a lot of the experiments, if you can call them that word. I would consider it to be torture. A lot of the torture that was carried out by them was ridiculous, but it served a scientific purpose for a secular society based on fundamentals of social Darwinism for the greater good. So we have twin children, various experimentation, genetics experiments who look at fertility and sterilization, the use of chemical weapons, mustard gas, injecting them with various diseases and seeing how they would react, freezing body temperature down to 5 degrees Celsius and seeing if the person could recover. Head injuries. We had a boy, it mentions that a boy was tied to a chair and then a hammer would come down and strike him on his head, and then they would carry out experiment to determine how much of an impact that had. Then they would increase the blow, and obviously eventually that would kill the person. Body part transplantation, you moving body parts across and seeing how much of a body they could move over. Literally, you're talking Frankenstein stuff here. And seawater experimentation. Individuals were given seawater to drink and to see how long people could last for. There's some of the notes that the doctors wrote where individuals were basically licking the floor after it had been mopped. That's how desperate they were for water. Where was the ethics? Where was the morality there? Can science, once left alone in the hands of the atheists, actually give us good results? It is because of this that we ended up with the Nuremberg Code of Medical Ethics. But the issue is, people will say, well, look, we learn from that. You see, that's science. We make mistakes, if you can use that word as mistakes, because the number of people that were killed here goes into the millions. But we make mistakes and we learn from the mistakes. But why do we need to learn from mistakes when the original guidance already exists, when Allah, the Almighty, does not permit any of this at all? No permissibility of this at all. So why do we need to learn and find what's right and what's wrong when we're already being told what is right and what is wrong? So how many more mistakes are we going to make and continue to learn when we already have the text with us? So clearly that demonstrates that we can't be good without Allah. So that also challenges the 3 points that were raised when these atheists gathered together in 2006 to put forward this argumentation. I hope I've dismantled all 3 of their positions and clearly showed what ridiculous nature it possesses. So atheism, let's get now down to the brass tacks. It's a religion like all other religions. It's about power and authority. That's what this is all about. It's about controlling people. It's about turning people away from the servitude of Allah to servitude of select individuals. Okay. It's about lies and hypocrisy. It's about poor science, bad science. It's about extrapolating learning from within Christianity and extending it onto other faiths. It's about deceiving individuals using this word science and what the average person knows about science, and they know, well, that's fact. Science is fact. I did it at GCSE or at secondary school level, because most people are only going to remember science at that level, and that's a fact. Carbon exists, nitrogen exists, physics exists. What they're mentioning by the word science are laws. like we've got Boyle's law, like we've got Newton's law, and like we've got law of thermodynamics and things of that nature. So it's those, and those are proven. Gravity exists. Every time you pick your phone up, you drop it down. So when they conflate, when they bring this understanding and link science to say this is what science is, what they're not saying is that who is controlling the science. Laws can't be controlled, they are just observed. But what can be controlled is what people can and do when you give them a knife in their hand or give them a laboratory, which is not controlled by any level of ethical conduct. The argument is that the whole universe is a huge coincidence. Everything came about by chance, yet nothing else can come about by chance in between. We have no soul. There's no such thing as a soul. And we come from nothing and we go to nothing. But we have this ex nihilo nihil, which is out of nothing, nothing comes. Which, how can that be that we've come from nothing and we go to nothing? It's not an understanding we can accept. Then obviously there is the concept of evolution, which gives another narrative for how humans arrived on the surface of the earth to challenge the Adam and Eve or Hawa understanding that we have. But that I will discuss in more detail in my two-part series, which I've labeled aptly evolution, devolution, or devolution. Evolution obviously makes sense. Devolution meaning devolving power away from Allah, and devolution because it's the devil's work, and which is diluting understanding of what we should do. So that's the title which is coming up. Well, okay. We seem to have done a good job on dealing with atheism, or at least you will see that everything I presented to you is rationally sound. But then if not atheism, why Islam then? Why can't it be any other faith? Well, first of all, let's speak about the individual who brought Islam recently, 1400 years ago. And I say recently because as Muslims, they accept all the prophets to be sound and correct, all the way back to Adam, and all the way up to Prophet Muhammad, including Isa, Jesus, including Moses, Musa, alayhi salatu wasalam. So all these are Anbiya, but they all came to bring people back from the wandering away from the path back onto the straight path. So let's talk about Prophet Muhammad. Well, he was unlettered and not educated by humans. He had not spent any time studying anything with anybody, so he was a blank piece of paper ready for God's word to be written on him. He was a very morally upright and of exceptional character. And this information that we have is recorded historically, and nobody disputes, or hardly anybody disputes it, or let me rephrase that, hardly anybody who warrants recognition historically disputes any of this. They all agree that this was the nature of the man. And he lived amongst his people for 40 years. Not getting involved in any of their practices, but he lived amongst them and he was highly regarded amongst them. He was regarded as the trustworthy one, the honest one. He had very little knowledge of the Judeo-Christian faiths. And I mention this because when we talk about the unlettered and not educated by humans and the very little knowledge of these faiths, the reason I mention this is because some hold the argument that Prophet Muhammad took from the Jews and the Christians and then slightly modified it. Or he just took directly from the Jews and Christians. Well, he didn't know anything about the Judea. There were no Jews living in Mecca at the time. And the Christians he would hardly come across except if they were coming for business into Mecca, and then he would hardly meet them to discuss faith issues. And if he happened to travel to Syria the once or twice or the few times that he went, then he may have come across one or two individuals. Well, really, he did not know at all about the Christian faith, what happened with Mary, Maryam alayhi salam, what happened with Jesus, Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. So many of these individuals he did not know about, apart from their names. He performed miracles, and I've already mentioned to you, some nowadays individuals have an issue with miracles. And what is a miracle? Well, basically a miracle is against the laws of science. We have the laws of science. I mentioned some to you already. We have Boyle's law, which mentions that given a constant temperature, the product of the volume and pressure of a fixed quantity of an ideal gas is constant. And that is a law. That's always the case. We have Newton's first law of motion. An object at rest will remain at rest unless acted upon by an external and unbalanced force, and an object in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by an external and an unbalanced force. So this is a law. And then we have the law of the conservation of energy, that the total amount of energy in an isolated system remains constant. These are laws. But these laws were put in place by Allah. And He did not just place these laws in place and then leave them. He's involved with them all the time. So a miracle is when an individual does something which goes against these laws. And the impression that's given is that these laws nobody can ever go against these laws. It's ridiculous. So that's why people can't accept miracles. And instead of discussing them, they will ridicule them. They will try, again, it's the reduction ad absurdum argument, or what you really believe, that a man can travel on a flying horse, and the words they'll use, and fly from Mecca and go all the way across to Baitul Maqdis and then the seven heavens. You really believe that? Can that actually happen? Has it been witnessed? But again, we're trying to use science to measure a miracle, and science can't measure miracles, so we're using the wrong tools. We're using the wrong tools, and this is because in the new atheist mindset, even though it's false, even though he claims he uses science, he thinks everything has to be measured by science, yet he doesn't adopt that same practice upon himself. So if something that can't be measured, so nobody has observed a flying horse, and that means they don't exist. But that's nonsense. We've already realized that these things, it only happened once. So for it to happen once, it could only have been observed at that time. It can't be observed again. Just because something can't be observed ever again, that means a one-off can't take place. Of course, a one-off can take place. So splitting the moon, water coming from the hands of the Prophet, and many, many others. I've just recorded one or two of them to show that he performed miracles, and the people that were present observed these miracles. He mentioned these stories of the prophets, and these were different to what is currently in the Tanakh and in the New Testament. They're not the same, so we find a very different version with respect to many of the prophets. And the versions seem more fitting to a prophet compared to the ones we find in the Old Testament in particular. And these are more appropriate, and also explains things which we find confusing within the New Testament. But I've got a separate slide to discuss that. We also find out within the prophet explaining the stories of past people. He gives detailed explanations of what happened to them, where they lived, what they used to do, which actually correlated with historical facts. He detailed matters that were not public, of events and things which were taking place there and then. So we have here a man who's not been educated or taught by any of the men, who's not sat with the people of the book, explaining things which were impossible for him to explain. He made prophecies about the immediate future, the discussion he has particularly about the Byzantium Empire that is defeated, but then after several years becomes victorious, and many other prophecies about immediate future which took place. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah, when it was signed, which looked like an immediate loss for the Muslims, but it was described as a victory. And within the space of a few years, victory was granted. So there were many prophecies, a prophecy about his Abu Lahab, that he would die as a non-Muslim, and many, many others that were made about the immediate future. So all of these that we have here now, obviously the stories of the prophets, we have different versions, but when we talk about stories of the past people, but even the stories of the prophet are more befitting a prophet, that we would understand. So once we have a prophet defined, and this is a scientific way, once we define a prophet, so let's define a prophet. A prophet is a person who receives revelation from God, who receives revelation from Allah. So he must be the best of people. He must be away from transgression. He must not be a sinner. He must be a pure person. That's how we would define a prophet. That's using reasoning. We've not looked into the biblical definition of a prophet or the Quranic definition of a prophet. We're just using reason here. So that reason tells us that's what we would expect, the best of the best, the elite. Now, when we look at the narratives and the stories mentioned in the Tanakh, the New Testament, and in the Quran, the only one in which we find that meets our sort of rational model of analysis in terms of what a prophet is what we find within the Quran. And obviously this is historically proven, and this was also proven at the time which was recorded, as was this. So virtually everything has proven to be sound from Prophet Muhammad. He invited people to think and reflect. He did not force his views, or he did not force his religion on anybody. He invited people to think and reflect. And in fact, many a times, even though he was very persuasive, was Prophet Muhammad, very persuasive, because he knew he was right, he was told many a times to leave it. And Allah mentions in the Quran that Hidayat, guidance, is from him. So he can't compel people to, no matter how much of an argument he puts forward. He made no personal request. He did not ask, yet he was given the opportunity to become a leader of Mecca. He did not choose to do so. Even when he conquered Mecca, he left Mecca and went back to his abode in Medina and passed away a year or so after. So he had no intention of becoming a leader and ruling over anybody. He made no personal request for money. Anybody who accepted Islam, he did not ask money from them. The money that was requested, for example, the zakah or anything else that was collected, would go into the treasury and was used then for the weak and for the poor and for those who had no family support. So he was not gaining anything from a worldly perspective. Very different to what we hear the prophets of today, the new atheist prophets. He allowed people to freely choose their faith with no ridicule or belittling. So we saw that the Christians and the Jews were permitted to carry on, even though he was in authority, to carry on in their own faith. We see in Medina, where Jews carry on believing in Judaism, they would actually go to their own rabbis to determine their law. They would not, and in fact, they actually chose to come to Prophet Muhammad because of his honesty. Not what we see now from the new age prophets, the new atheistic prophets, who feel that it's better to ridicule, have hatred, and belittle. Who is speaking the truth and who is speaking falsehood? Who is blind and who is rational? Who is being irrational? The Quran itself, why should we accept the Quran then? Well, the Quran is the last time that God spoke to humans. And whenever we have, and I give an example, that whenever we have a policy, for example, and we learn something within that policy, or something changes, some guidelines change or whatever, we then issue another policy which then overrules and overrides the policy of the past. So the Quran was the last time God spoke. So any confusions that people had, remember, let's not forget that Tanakh was 450 Common Era, before Common Era, and we saw the New Testament rather was around 80 Common Era. So these mistakes had already made their way in, because the Muslims consider them to be the modified Injil and the modified Torah, not the original. So when God spoke, he spoke again to correct the misunderstandings that had crept in to the Judaic faith and the misunderstandings that had crept in particularly to the Christian faith. So it supersedes all other texts. Other texts no longer in revealed form. We've already mentioned that an oral tradition originally, and then they were written significantly after. And obviously many people had died, those who had recorded, those who had the oral tradition. And then we've seen that many are translated. So we're now picking, particularly within the Christian faith, where we don't actually learn the original language, and neither do we learn. So therefore, we're getting a translation, and the translation obviously varies. But also modifications have been made to it when a certain theology, when a certain belief was accepted. It made its way backwards into the text in order to justify it. Whereas the Quran was sent to last until the end of time, it was prophesied in the former text that Prophet Muhammad would come, there would be this last prophet, and that there would be no messenger after him. It's memorized and recited daily. It's the only book that's memorized and recited daily. It's the only book that's actually recited in the month of Ramadan in totality, and individuals, most people stand in prayer listening to it. But in daily life, our daily 5 prayers, it's used. It's practiced by millions of people on a daily basis. And I mean by practice, I mean at all levels. And it's the only text which is revealed over 23 years. All of the texts were revealed in one instant. So within that, we have a complete legal apparatus, because we see its application. And talking about application, it can be applied in all situations, because what we see over this 23-year period is the Muslims starting as a persecuted minority and eventually becoming a majority politically, and I've discussed this in great detail in some of my other videos. It's accepted by people of various ethnicities and walks of life. We're talking about, Chinese, centuries ago, Caucasus, South America, the Americas, Africa, Middle East, India, Far East, and different walks of life, women, men, young children, and all over. It's the fastest growing religion in the West, and it has a global message. Now, I wanted to touch upon the confusing issues that we find within Christianity, which is then exploited by these new atheists to try to ridicule that everybody who believes have these problems with them, and they then extrapolate them and extend them onto the other faiths. The Trinity, the Trinity is a confusing issue. Three in one. We're talking about the Holy Spirit, the Father, and the Son, all combined within one. How does Islam solve this problem of Trinity? Because Christians are confused with it. And this is why the Quran came to deal with some of the confusions which had taken place within Christianity. Well, the point there is that there are three separate entities. There is Allah, there is the Holy Spirit, and there is the Prophet Jesus. So there are three separate individuals. Now that makes so much sense and is so clear. Sacrificing his son for the sins of man, this concept of a divine son. Again, this doesn't reason well. And a religion has to be reasonable. And we can understand why atheists pick up on Christianity and then try to ridicule all faiths because of that. There's another issue. We have a divine being as God. We have a human as Mary. And then we have a child, which is a combination of the two. And it kind of takes you back to Greek mythology of the gods having intimacy with the humans and producing sort of like godchildren or whatever you want to call them. So it's something borrowed from the Greek misunderstanding. If God was going to take a son, or if any son was going to be called the son of God, then that would surely have been Adam, because Adam had no father or mother. So that would make more sense. So again, we can see how atheists pick up on these points. The concept of original sin, that Adam and Eve committed sin in paradise, and therefore we're all born with this original sin. Well, this again confused because people are being held accountable for something that they never did. And also then God is having to sacrifice his only son so that we don't bear that sin. So it becomes so confusing, and it becomes so, leaves a person wondering, where does that leave me? So the original sin concept, again, what does Islam say about that? Well, Islam says quite clearly that there is no such thing as original sin. Each person will bear his own burden. I did touch upon the son issue there. This is also quite clear, Islam says about this concept, that God has no son. God needs no son. Allah needs no son. Allah needs no partner. He has no need for things of that. He is a God. He is above that. And this is a confusion. This was a spirit blown by Gabriel, who brought that down to Maryam, and blew within her until she conceived. And the child that was born was a miracle child, and he was a normal child. He was a normal child for a prophet, but a normal child biologically speaking. He did not have no divine connection. And we see similarly with Prophet Zechariah, where he is also of such an age, as is his wife, that they can't have children. And he's given the glad tidings of Yahya. And these two stories, John, and these two stories are intertwined to explain that you don't need to reach some strange conclusion to try to, take this information and try to fit it in. It's quite simple. Mary's chastity is brought into question then, because in some views she's considered to be the wife of Joseph, and in others she's not. So we have this problem arising. Whereas within Islam, it's quite simple. She was a virgin. She had not married, and she didn't marry, and she gave birth to this pious child, which was a miracle, because it would lose its miraculous nature if she was married to a man. Why? Because then there's a possibility that the man she was married to, that it was his child, It wasn't miraculous that he was the father. And why would that be considered as a miraculous birth if a man and a woman who are of age to have children have a child? What's the miraculous nature of that? This was a miracle, and the miracle was this miracle birth. So clearly we can see that the Islamic understanding of a miracle birth is clear. So we're seeing much more clarity within Islam. Idolatry has made its way within Christianity. So we see now a huge cross when we walk into a church, and we see supposedly Jesus there crucified upon there. And we know that Jesus stood against idolatry. So it's something else and it starts to make the religion inconsistent and arguably, from what we've described already, incoherent. And this is what the new atheists pick up on and use this as their model of belief and then try to take it apart. O children of Israel, we see Jesus' message continuously being, O children of Israel, O children of Israel. Well, that clearly means that anybody who's not a child of Israel, he's not addressing. And therefore, he's clearly mentioning that his message is limited. He's only targeting those individuals who identify themselves as children of Israel that were living after Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, after Moses, before the arrival of Prophet Muhammad in that geographical location and in that particular time. Now, this issue of Jesus' resurrection, where he dies and then he's resurrected, in order to try to understand why is it that he did not die when he's walking around. People get confused. They say, well, he was put on a cross. On the cross he died. He was then buried or entombed, and then he made his way out of the tomb. So he must have come back to life again, and then he was taken up to the heavens. So it becomes a little bit confusing. Whereas again, the narrative from Islam is quite simple in that he was never killed. It was made to seem like he was killed. He was actually still alive, walking around. So we don't have to explain this. How did he move from the cross and tomb, and then how was he resurrected? He was then just taken up to the heavens, and he is with Allah in the heavens. Can I sin? Well, there doesn't seem to be any structure in place within Christianity which, stops me from sinning. What's the motivation for stopping me from sinning if I know that the only Son of God has been sacrificed for my sins, and I can now just live my life as I choose? Why should I not sin? So again, we had the conversation, can I be good without Allah, or can we be good without Allah? Well, can I be good with knowing that I'm never going to be punished for what I do? Surely then it sends the wrong message to me. Again, it becomes an area of incoherence and lack of understanding. So then the big question comes is, what purpose does the Bible serve? If the Bible isn't really supposed to be acted upon word for word, if it's not so, because we have all these concerns in there that we find in there, which have then been corrected as we find in the Quran, then what purpose does it serve? Well, if it doesn't serve any purpose whatsoever, but just something to take prayers from, just something to take, just to read from, for no purpose, then in a way, God's word has no impact on our day-to-day life. So where is God's word? And some will say, well, I have a personal God. Well, then how are we any different than a prophet? How are we any different than anybody else? And how can we prove that that's God talking to us? And we have to reason. We have to then try to reason and understand that. So we've been able to demonstrate why we think the new atheists in particular sort of pick on Christianity, but also why Christianity, due to those issues and inconsistency and lack and places incoherence, can lead to that. So that's why Islam is the solution in all of these arguments. We know that human is made of both body and soul. That's something we can't deny. We have obviously the physical human form, but we also have a soul. And this soul is something which makes you. And this soul is something that was created, but it does not die. It lives forever. So we move from one phase to another. Once our souls were created and we were in the presence of God, we were in the presence of Allah, we were then sent one by one down into our bodies whilst we were still within our mother's wombs. And then we came into the world and we lived into the world, and then eventually our soul will be separated from the body, and that's called death. And when death occurs, then obviously our organic part of our body will eventually decompose. But our souls will continue to live forever, and we'll be given different forms. We will have different forms in which our souls will go into. And these are the ones which will then either take pain or these will be the ones which actually will take enjoyment, where we either, in which of the two scenarios, we live in for eternity. And I touched upon the concept of a fetus. And it's a very good example, because imagine that we were able to go into the fetus and speak to the child that was in there and said, look, I come from another world. And the fetus says, yes, where do you come from? I come from a world outside. And so the fetus says, okay, explain to me. And he says, well, let me tell you, there is another world after this. And the fetus says, I don't believe you. Why? Because he's going to use a scientific way. The scientific way is that I can only accept that things exist if I can either reason them, and I can't reason them at the moment, even though he should be able to reason them, because he's got to think, where's my mum? If my mum is not in here with me, then where is my mum? And who is providing me this food? Where is this food coming from? Whatever. So even then, you should be able to reason that another God exists. So, arguably the scientific way still works even in that scenario. But definitely the empirical sort of world, the empirical method won't exist, because it's something you can't measure, it's something you can't see, it's something you can't experiment with. So you might challenge that and say, no, I don't. If you then start telling the fetus that, look, eventually you're going to wear clothes, you're going to have to eat through your mouth, that hole there, you're going to walk around, you're going to talk, you're going to run, you're going to have, there's lots of others like you in this other world. If we try to explain the world to this fetus, it's never going to accept it at all. He says, and how big is this world of yours? The fetus says. And you say, oh, the world is huge. Thousands and miles, thousands and thousands. You could walk. It would take you days just to walk from one part of an island to another part of an island. And he's saying, don't be so silly. This is the world. It's just this. This is what's around me. Nothing can be as big as that. So hopefully I've been able to demonstrate from that example how one struggles to accept another world. But God in his mercy, Allah in his mercy, has not left us just to reason. Whilst we're sat in the womb of this world, he's not left us just to reason. He's given us guidance. He's given us a book in order for us to understand. Sometimes people ask the question, well, look, if Allah exists, why the evil then? He must be an evil God. Why does he allow evil to happen? Well, this is a very simplistic and childish way, and one of the argument that's put forward by the new atheists is that, well, if God really existed, then he wouldn't be evil. And if God does exist and there's evil, then he's not a good God. So in either way, they're trying to cancel the influence of God. Well, let's first set the stall out. Allah is the only creator and he's all powerful. So there is no battle between God and Satan. That doesn't exist. And we see that coming about within the Christian theology, this battle between God and Satan. It's a battle of good versus evil, which is fought by creatures. And we all have a choice. We all choose what we choose to do, but we will be accountable for that choice. Nobody will bear our burden, and neither will we bear somebody else's burden. We are all accountable for our own life, our own sins, our own good deeds. And life is, as I've said, a test. And there are those who suffer the consequences of this evil, and we stand by, and that's where our reaction to those who suffer. So evil will exist. Evil isn't necessarily evil. Why? Because there will be individuals who will suffer consequences. So we'll be given an option to do good or to do bad. And if we do bad, then obviously we'll be accountable for that. If we do good, then we will be rewarded for that. So this is the simple reason why evil exists. This is not supposed to be heaven. Heaven, Jannah, is in the next world. This is a world of trials and tribulations. It's only because the atheists want to make us think that this is the only world that they then have a problem why evil exists in this world. Otherwise, if they knew that this wasn't the only world, then they won't be too concerned about why evil exists in this world. So do we agree at all with new atheists? Well, tongue-in-cheek, possibly. Dawkins says, I don't have a very starry school's career. I was medium to above average, nothing special. Dawkins, my man, I can't disagree with the nothing special part. But before I leave you, I want to just leave you this little poem that I found, which really summed up. Atheists determining the truth. Atheists believing that they're the ones who can determine the truth. And the truth can't be determined. And they're saying that the truth can only be determined by the scientific way. And that can't be determined through revelation. That revelation cannot tell us about who exists, where we will go, will we be accounted for, where do we go when we die, where did we come from. But they say, no, truth is only what we can determine. And a verse that I quote there, الَّذِينَ اتَّخَذُوا دِينَهُمْ لَهْوًا وَلَعِبًا, those who take their religion as a plaything as a pastime. They're not serious. What's happened to them? وَغَرَتْهُمُ الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا. The life of this world has deceived them. فَالْيَوْمَ نَنْسَاهُمْ. Then on that day we will forget them. كَمَا نَسُوا لِقَاءَ يَوْمِهِمْ. Like the way they forget the meeting of theirs. وَمَا كَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يَجْحَدُونَ. So here we can see that the atheists are warned that look, you're taking this very lightheartedly as though it's a joke. You're always ridiculing. You're always laughing. All that's happened here is the life of this world has deceived you. You're in the womb. You think this is the only world. And when news from the outside comes to you to tell you about the world outside, you're in denial of it. You cannot accept it. Why can you not accept it? Because then you would have to prepare for that world. And you're not willing to prepare for that world. Why? Because you want to be God. You want to decide what is right, not have somebody tell you what is right. That's all based on arrogance and denial. And that's why it is the religion of those who deny the denial of God. But let me share this poem with you, which really sums this up nicely. It was 6 men of Hindustan to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observant might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, God bless me, but the elephant is nothing but a wall. The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, Ho, what have we made? What have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp, to meet is mighty clear. This wonder of an elephant is very like a spear. The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a snake. The fourth reached out his eager hand, and felt about the knee. What most this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain, quoth he. 'Tis clear enough the elephant is very like a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, Even the blindest man can tell what this resembles most. Deny the fact who can. The marvel of an elephant is very like a fan. The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, then seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, I see, quoth he, the elephant is very like a rope. And so these men of Hindustan disputed long and long, each in his own opinion exceedingly stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. So oft in the theological wars the disputants, I ween, tread on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about the elephant not one of them has seen. Now I will slightly change John Godfrey Sachs' poem that he wrote, and I will say this is a very much an understanding that we have of the atheists, the new atheists in particular. So arrogant and so headstrong in their opinion, blind as a bat, feeling and using whatever they can feel, their own senses, to reach to what they believe is to the truth. When if we look at this with somebody with has been given knowledge, has been given true understanding, takes a step back and says it's an elephant. I hope that the 2-part series has somewhat been enjoyable and has challenged the view within that new atheism that exists, and maybe it was even slightly entertaining. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح يسعك الفضاء